The morning sun cast long shadows across the Apache camp when Ayanna first saw the stranger riding toward their settlement. She was gathering water from the stream when the sound of hoofbeats made her look up. The man on horseback was different from anyone she had ever seen. His skin was pale like winter clouds, and his hair gleamed golden in the sunlight. He wore the clothes of a trader, with leather saddlebags filled with goods that clinked softly as his horse moved. Ayanna's heart skipped a beat, though she couldn't understand why. She had been taught from childhood to be wary of outsiders, especially those who looked nothing like her people. Her father, Chief Nalnish, had always warned that strangers brought trouble to their peaceful mountain home. The Apache had learned this lesson through bitter experience over many generations. The trader's name was Thomas McKenna, and he had come seeking to establish peaceful trade relationships with the Apache. He carried no weapons openly and approached with his hands visible, showing respect for their customs. When he reached the camp's edge, he dismounted and waited to be acknowledged, demonstrating that he understood Apache protocol. Chief Nalnish received the stranger with cautious courtesy. The Apache way was to show hospitality to peaceful visitors, but trust had to be earned slowly. Thomas spoke a few words in broken Apache, which surprised everyone. He had clearly made an effort to learn their language before coming. This small gesture meant more to the chief than the valuable goods Thomas carried. Ayanna watched from a distance as her father and the council of elders met with Thomas. She noticed how respectfully he listened when the elders spoke, how he never interrupted or showed impatience. Most outsiders who came to trade were loud and demanding, treating the Apache as if they were less than human. Thomas was different. He asked permission before each action, waited to be invited to sit, and accepted the simple meal offered without complaint. During the 3 days of negotiations, Ayanna found herself stealing glances at the stranger. She observed how gently he handled his horse, how he helped an elderly woman who dropped her burden without being asked, and how he played simple games with the Apache children, who had overcome their initial fear. These small acts revealed his character more clearly than any words could have. Thomas noticed Ayanna watching him, though she tried to be subtle about it. When their eyes met across the camp circle, she felt something stir within her that she had never experienced before. It was not just curiosity about his different appearance, but something deeper. She saw kindness in his blue eyes and genuine respect in how he interacted with her people. On the final evening of his visit, Thomas approached Ayanna while she worked on beading a ceremonial dress. He asked permission to sit nearby, and when she nodded, he remained respectfully distant. They began to talk first about simple things like the beauty of the mountains and the changing seasons. Thomas's Apache was limited, but Ayanna had learned some English from previous traders, so they managed to communicate. Their conversation revealed how much they had in common despite their different backgrounds. Both loved the freedom of the wilderness, both valued family above material possessions, and both believed that people should be judged by their actions rather than their appearance. As the fire died down and the stars emerged overhead, Ayanna felt a connection forming that frightened and thrilled her simultaneously. When Thomas prepared to leave the next morning, he asked Chief Nalnish for permission to return in 2 moons' time. The trading had gone well and both sides had benefited. The chief agreed, pleased with Thomas's respectful behavior and fair dealings. As Thomas mounted his horse, he looked directly at Ayanna and spoke a single word in Apache that made her heart race. Until we meet again. Ayanna watched until Thomas disappeared over the ridge, knowing that her life had changed forever. She had always assumed she would marry within her tribe, following the traditions of her ancestors. Now she found herself thinking about blue eyes and golden hair, about gentle hands and respectful words. She tried to push these thoughts away, knowing they could only lead to trouble, but they persisted like seeds planted in fertile soil. The other women in the camp had noticed the looks that passed between Ayanna and the trader. Some whispered among themselves, concerned about what such an attraction might mean. Ayanna's mother, Desba, was particularly worried. She had seen how relationships between Apache women and outsiders ended, and the results were rarely happy. The two worlds were too different, the prejudices too strong on both sides. But Ayanna couldn't forget Thomas's kind words, or the way he had treated her people with genuine respect. She began counting the days until his promised return, though she told no one of her growing feelings. She threw herself into her daily tasks with unusual energy, trying to distract herself from thoughts of the blue-eyed stranger who had ridden into her orderly world and turned it upside down. 2 moons later, Thomas returned as promised. This time, his visit lasted longer as he established regular trading routes with several Apache bands in the region. He brought items the Apache valued: steel knives, colorful blankets, and glass beads, trading them for hand-woven baskets, tanned hides, and turquoise jewelry. More importantly, he brought news from the outside world and stories of distant places. Ayanna found herself looking forward to these trading sessions, not just for the goods Thomas brought, but for their evening conversations. They would sit by the fire after the day's business was done, sharing stories of their different worlds. Thomas told her about green valleys far to the east where his family farmed, about cities with more people than she could imagine, and about the great waters that stretched beyond the horizon. In return, Ayanna shared the legends of her people, the ancient stories of how the Apache came to these mountains and learned to live in harmony with the land. She taught him the names of plants and animals in Apache, and explained the spiritual significance of the sacred sites that dotted their territory. Thomas listened with genuine fascination, asking thoughtful questions that showed his deep respect for Apache culture. Their friendship deepened slowly over many months. Thomas began timing his visits to coincide with Apache ceremonies and celebrations, always asking permission and observing respectfully from the edges. During one harvest festival, he even participated in the communal work, helping to process pine nuts alongside the men of the tribe. This gesture earned him grudging acceptance from some of the warriors who had initially viewed him with suspicion. Ayanna's feelings for Thomas grew stronger with each visit, though she kept them carefully hidden. She began learning English more seriously, trading lessons with an old woman who had lived among settlers for a time. She wanted to communicate with Thomas in his own language, to understand not just his words but the thoughts behind them. When she surprised him by speaking a complete sentence in fluent English, his face lit up with such joy that her heart almost stopped. The turning point came during the winter when a severe blizzard trapped Thomas in the Apache camp for nearly 2 weeks. Instead of being impatient to leave, he threw himself into helping however he could. He chopped wood for the elderly, helped repair winter shelters, and even learned to make snowshoes in the Apache style. During the long winter evenings, he and Ayanna spent hours talking by the fire. It was during one of these conversations that Thomas finally spoke the words that had been growing in both their hearts. He told Ayanna that he had never met anyone who understood him as completely as she did, that her wisdom and strength amazed him daily. When he asked if she might consider becoming his wife, Ayanna felt tears of joy spring to her eyes. She had been hoping for those words but hadn't dared to believe he would speak them. However, their joy was tempered by the reality of their situation. Both knew that their love would face enormous obstacles from both their peoples. Thomas's own family would likely reject an Apache wife, viewing her as savage and uncivilized despite her intelligence and grace. Many Apache would see their union as a betrayal of tribal traditions and a dangerous opening to outside influence. Ayanna struggled with the decision for weeks. She loved Thomas deeply, but she also loved her people and her way of life. Could she really leave everything she had ever known to follow him into an uncertain future? Would his people ever accept her, or would she always be an outsider in his world? The questions tormented her during sleepless nights as she weighed love against loyalty, personal happiness against tribal obligation. Thomas, too, wrestled with doubts. He had seen how other mixed marriages had ended, with the couples caught between two worlds and fully accepted by neither. He knew he was asking Ayanna to give up far more than he was sacrificing. Her entire identity was tied to her Apache heritage. While he could more easily adapt to life in any environment his trading took him, the decision was made for them when Ayanna realized she was carrying Thomas's child. The discovery filled her with both joy and terror. There was no hiding this development, and soon the entire camp would know of their relationship. They had kept their love secret for months, meeting away from the camp and communicating through carefully coded glances during public gatherings. Now everything would be exposed. When Ayanna told Thomas the news, he immediately asked her to marry him according to Apache custom. He wanted to do everything properly, to show respect for her family and traditions even as they prepared to face the storm of disapproval that was sure to come. He went to Chief Nalnish and formally requested permission to court his daughter, even though it was far too late for such formalities. Chief Nalnish's reaction was explosive. He had trusted Thomas as a trading partner, but he had never imagined the man would dare to involve himself romantically with an Apache woman. The chief felt betrayed by both his daughter and the trader he had welcomed into their camp. He ordered Thomas to leave immediately and never return, threatening violence if he refused to comply. Ayanna pleaded with her father to reconsider, explaining that she loved Thomas and that he had treated her with nothing but respect and honor. She reminded her father of all the ways Thomas had proven himself worthy, all the times he had helped their people and shown genuine care for Apache welfare. But the chief's anger was too great to be swayed by such arguments. In his mind, Thomas had violated the sacred trust of hospitality and corrupted his daughter with foreign ideas and desires. The confrontation between Chief Nalnish and his daughter shattered the peace of the Apache camp. Word spread quickly through the settlement that Ayanna was carrying the trader's child, and the reaction was swift and harsh. Many of the tribal elders sided with the chief, viewing the situation as a dangerous breach of tradition that could invite trouble from the outside world. They remembered too well the conflicts that had arisen when Apache women had relationships with outsiders in the past. Ayanna found herself suddenly isolated within her own community. Women who had been her friends since childhood now avoided her, whispering behind their hands when she passed. The men looked at her with a mixture of anger and disappointment, feeling that she had betrayed not just her family but the entire tribe. Even the children sensed the tension and kept their distance, confused by the adult's strange behavior towards someone they had always respected. Her mother, Desba, was torn between love for her daughter and loyalty to her husband and tribe. She tried to convince Ayanna to give up the child once it was born, to let another family raise it while she returned to the traditional path of an Apache woman. Desba arranged meetings with suitable Apache men who might still consider marrying her daughter despite the scandal, but Ayanna refused all such suggestions. She would not abandon the child she carried, nor would she pretend that her love for Thomas had never existed. The situation grew worse when Thomas attempted to return to the camp, despite Chief Nalnish's banishment. He arrived with gifts for the chief and formal promises to convert to Apache ways, to learn their customs completely and become a true member of the tribe. He offered to give up his trading business and dedicate himself entirely to Apache life, if that was what it took to marry Ayanna and raise their child among her people. Chief Nalnish met Thomas at the camp's boundary with a group of armed warriors. The chief's face was carved from stone as he listened to Thomas's proposals, then rejected them all without consideration. He declared that no amount of gifts or promises could erase the dishonor Thomas had brought upon his daughter and his tribe. The chief ordered Thomas to leave the territory entirely and never return, threatening to treat him as an enemy if he was seen in Apache lands again. Thomas refused to leave without speaking to Ayanna. The standoff lasted for hours, with the trader maintaining his position at the camp's edge while the warriors kept their weapons ready. Finally, Ayanna herself appeared, walking slowly through the circle of hostile faces to reach the man she loved. The conversation between them was brief but intense, conducted in whispers while the entire camp watched. Ayanna made a decision that shocked everyone present. She announced that she would leave with Thomas, giving up her Apache identity to become his wife in the white man's world. The gasps and cries that greeted this declaration revealed the depth of emotion her choice had stirred. Her mother collapsed in tears while her father's face showed a pain deeper than anger. Her younger siblings stared in disbelief, unable to comprehend that their beloved sister was abandoning them forever. The chief's response was swift and final. He formally declared Ayanna dead to the tribe, stating that she no longer existed as his daughter or as an Apache. Her name would not be spoken again, her deeds would not be remembered, and her children would forever be strangers to their Apache heritage. The ceremony of disownment was brutal in its finality, erasing Ayanna from the official memory of her people as if she had never been born. Ayanna gathered her few personal possessions, while the camp watched in stunned silence. Her traditional clothing, her jewelry, her ceremonial items, all the physical connections to her Apache identity were left behind as symbols of what she was abandoning. She took only practical items for travel and a small medicine bag that had belonged to her grandmother, the one link to her heritage that she could not bear to leave. The journey away from the Apache camp was the most painful experience of Ayanna's life. As she walked beside Thomas's horse, carrying their unborn child within her, She felt each step taking her further from everything she had ever known and loved. The mountains that had sheltered her childhood grew smaller behind them, and the familiar sounds and smells of home faded into memory. Thomas tried to comfort her, promising that they would build a good life together, that their children would know love even if they never knew acceptance from either of their parents' peoples. He spoke of the trading post he planned to establish, of the cabin he would build for their family, of the future he envisioned where their mixed heritage might actually become a strength rather than a burden. But Ayana's heart was breaking with each mile they traveled. She had chosen love over loyalty, personal happiness over tribal belonging, and the weight of that choice pressed down on her like a physical burden. She wondered if she would ever see her family again, if her children would grow up as strangers to half of their heritage, if the sacrifice she was making would prove worthwhile in the end. The couple traveled for days through wilderness territory, avoiding both Apache and white settlements where their unusual pairing might cause trouble. Thomas had planned their route carefully, knowing they needed to reach a place where mixed marriages were more common and accepted. He spoke of California, where many different peoples lived together with less rigid social boundaries, where their children might find acceptance that was impossible in either Apache or traditional white communities. During their journey, Ayana experienced the first stirrings of regret. The reality of her situation began to sink in as she faced the practical difficulties of life outside her familiar world. She had never lived anywhere but in Apache camps, never had to navigate the complex social rules of white society, never been completely alone without the support network of extended family and tribal relationships. Thomas and Ayana settled in a remote valley where a small community of traders, miners, and other outcasts had established a rough frontier town. Here their mixed marriage raised eyebrows but didn't provoke the violent reactions they had feared. The townspeople were too busy with their own struggles to spend much energy judging others, and Thomas's skills as a trader made him a valuable member of the community. Ayana gave birth to their first child, a daughter with her mother's dark eyes and her father's lighter skin. They named her Sarah, giving her both an English name for acceptance in white society and an Apache name, Itzel, meaning rainbow, which they spoke only in private. The birth was difficult, with no Apache midwives to guide Ayana through the traditional ceremonies and practices of her people. She felt profoundly alone during those long hours of labor, missing her mother and the community of women who should have surrounded her during this sacred time. Life in the frontier town was harsh and isolating for Ayana. The other women kept their distance, unsure how to relate to someone who looked different and came from a world they couldn't understand. They whispered about her Apache heritage, spreading rumors that she might be dangerous or unpredictable, even when she tried to be friendly and helpful, offering her knowledge of healing plants or her skills with beadwork. She was met with suspicion and rejection. Thomas worked long hours building his trading business, often away from home for days at a time. When he was gone, Ayana felt the full weight of her isolation. She would sit in their small cabin, holding baby Sarah, and sing Apache lullabies that no one else would ever understand. She taught her daughter words in Apache, determined that the child should know something of her mother's heritage even if she could never be part of that world. The pain of separation from her family grew worse rather than better as time passed. Ayana had hoped that distance and new responsibilities would ease the ache of homesickness, but instead she found herself dreaming constantly of her mountain home. She imagined her siblings growing up without her parents growing old without their daughter's care, and all the ceremonies and celebrations she would never share with them again. 2 years after Sarah's birth, Ayana gave birth to a son they named David, with the Apache name Nakai, meaning brother. The boy looked more like his father, with lighter hair and skin that might allow him to pass for white in most circumstances. Ayana felt a mixture of relief and sorrow at this realization. Her son would face fewer prejudices than his sister, but he would also be further removed from his Apache heritage. Thomas noticed his wife's growing sadness and tried to help in the ways he knew how. He brought her books to read, thinking education might fill the emptiness in her days. He encouraged her to start a small business making and selling traditional Apache crafts, hoping that connection to her culture might ease her homesickness. He even suggested they might visit her family someday when enough time had passed for tempers to cool, but Ayana knew that return was impossible. Her father's decree of disownment had been absolute, and Apache law did not allow for reversal of such decisions. She was dead to her people, and any attempt to contact them would only bring shame and trouble to her family. The finality of her situation pressed down on her like a stone, making each day a struggle to find reasons for hope. The isolation became even more pronounced when other families began moving into the area. These newcomers brought more traditional attitudes about race and marriage, and they made no attempt to hide their disapproval of Thomas's Apache wife. Their children were forbidden to play with Sarah and David, and shop owners began treating Ayanna with open rudeness when she tried to buy supplies. One particularly painful incident occurred when Ayanna took her children to the small schoolhouse that had been established in town. She hoped to enroll them in classes so they could learn to read and write in English, skills that would be essential for their future success. The teacher, a stern woman from back east, took one look at Ayanna and declared that Indian children were not welcome in her classroom. The humiliation of being turned away in front of her own children burned in Ayanna's memory for months afterward. Thomas was furious when he learned of the incident, confronting both the teacher and the town council about their discriminatory policies. His anger accomplished nothing except to make the family's position even more precarious. Some townspeople began talking about the need to maintain community standards and hinting that families like Thomas's might be happier elsewhere. The stress of constant rejection and isolation began to affect Ayanna's health. She lost weight and developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. She found herself struggling to find energy for daily tasks and began withdrawing even from Thomas and the children. The vibrant, confident woman he had fallen in love with seemed to be fading away, replaced by someone hollow and defeated. Thomas realized that their situation was becoming impossible. The town that had once seemed like a refuge was turning hostile, and his wife was dying slowly from heartbreak and isolation. He began making plans to move the family again, searching for a place where mixed families were more accepted, where their children could grow up with dignity and opportunities. But Ayanna had reached a point where she could no longer imagine a happy future anywhere. She felt trapped between two worlds that both rejected her, carrying children who would face the same impossible choices she had made. The love that had once seemed worth any sacrifice now felt like a chain, binding her to a life of perpetual alienation. She began to wonder if her father had been right, if some boundaries were meant never to be crossed. Years passed in a blur of hardship and small victories for Ayanna and her growing family. Thomas had moved them twice more, always searching for a community where they could find acceptance. Their third child, a son named Michael with the Apache, name Bidzil meaning strong one, was born during their stay in a mining camp where diversity was more common but life was harder and more dangerous. By this time, Sarah was 8 years old and already showing the effects of growing up between worlds. She was intelligent and curious, but she carried herself with a wariness unusual in children. She had learned to read the hostile expressions of adults and to protect her younger brothers from the worst of the taunts and exclusion they faced. The responsibility weighed heavily on her young shoulders, aging her beyond her years. David, now 6, had begun asking difficult questions about why they were different from other families, why his mother sometimes cried when she thought no one was looking, and why they moved so often. Thomas tried to explain their situation in ways the boy could understand. But how do you tell a child that love sometimes isn't enough to overcome the world's cruelty? Ayanna's health continued to deteriorate, despite Thomas's efforts to provide proper care. The constant stress of rejection and the grief of permanent separation from her family had worn away at her spirit until she was a shadow of her former self. She still cared for her children with fierce devotion, but the joy had gone out of her life. She moved through her days like someone walking in a dream, present but not fully alive. The breaking point came when little Michael fell seriously ill with a fever that wouldn't break. The local doctor, a man with traditional views about racial mixing, refused to treat the child properly. He suggested that mixed blood children were naturally weaker and that nature was simply taking its course. Thomas was beside himself with rage and desperation, but his anger couldn't cure his son or change the doctor's prejudiced mind. Ayanna watched her youngest child burning with fever and felt something snap inside her. All the pain and isolation of the past years crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. She knew what traditional Apache medicine could do for such illnesses, knowledge passed down through generations of her people. But that knowledge was cut off from her now, along with everything else she had sacrificed for love. In desperation, Ayanna began treating Michael with the few traditional remedies she could remember and prepare without proper guidance. She brewed teas from plants she found in the surrounding wilderness, sang healing songs in whispered Apache, and performed what ceremonies she could recall from childhood observations. Thomas watched with a mixture of hope and heartbreak as his wife fought to save their son, using the very heritage she had been forced to abandon. Miraculously, Michael's fever broke after 3 days of Ayanna's treatment. The child recovered completely, though he remained smaller and more fragile than his siblings. The experience had shown Ayanna the power she still carried within her Apache knowledge, but it also reminded her painfully of all she had lost. She began to wonder if her children might be better off knowing their mother's heritage, even if it meant facing additional prejudice. Around this time, disturbing news began reaching them from Apache territory. Tensions between the tribe and the growing number of white settlers had escalated into open conflict. Several Apache bands had begun raiding settlements in response to encroachment on their traditional lands, and the military was preparing a major campaign to force all Apache onto reservations far from their mountain homes. Thomas received reports through his trading contacts that Chief Nalnish had been killed in one of the early skirmishes, dying while defending a sacred site from destruction by miners. The news hit Ayanna like a physical blow. Her father was dead, and she had never had the chance to seek his forgiveness or let him meet his grandchildren. The finality of death made her exile absolute in a way that banishment never had. Ayanna learned that her mother, Desba, was now living with her oldest son, Ayanna's brother Kuruk, who had become a war leader in the growing conflict. Her younger siblings were scattered, some fighting with the resistance, others trying to find safety with relatives in more remote areas. The family she had known was dissolving under the pressure of war and loss, just as her own family was struggling to find its place in an unwelcoming world. The news from home sparked something in Ayanna that had been dormant for years. Despite everything she had endured, these were still her people facing their greatest crisis. Her children carried Apache blood, and they deserved to know the courage and strength of their heritage. She began teaching Sarah, David, and Michael more about their Apache ancestry, telling them stories of their grandfather's bravery and their grandmother's wisdom. Sarah proved especially eager to learn about her Apache heritage. She absorbed every story, every word of the language her mother taught her, every detail about traditional ways of life. The girl seemed to understand instinctively that this knowledge was precious and endangered, and she appointed herself the keeper of family history for her younger brothers. Thomas supported Ayanna's efforts to preserve their children's Apache heritage, but he was also worried about making their situation even more difficult. They were already outcasts in white society. Emphasizing their Indian ancestry could make things worse. However, he could see that connecting with her cultural roots was bringing some life back to his wife's eyes, and that was worth any additional hardship they might face. The family's dynamics began to shift as Ayanna reclaimed parts of her identity she had tried to suppress. She started wearing some traditional jewelry again, incorporating Apache foods into their meals when she could find the right plants and ingredients, and observing certain ceremonial practices in private. The children responded positively to these changes, seeming to gain confidence from understanding more about where they came from. But this cultural revival also highlighted the impossible position Ayanna found herself in. She could preserve fragments of Apache tradition for her children, but she could never give them the full experience of tribal belonging. They would always be outsiders looking in, carrying the blood and some of the knowledge, but never the complete identity that came from growing up within the community. The Apache wars intensified throughout the region, bringing refugees and desperate news to every frontier settlement. Thomas learned through his trading network that many Apache bands were being forcibly relocated to reservations hundreds of miles from their ancestral homes. The military campaign was systematic and brutal, aimed at ending Apache resistance once and for all. Ayanna's heart ached as she heard reports of the suffering her people were enduring. Families were separated, traditional ways of life were being destroyed, and many Apache were dying from disease and starvation on the barren reservation lands. She felt guilty for her own safety while her people faced extinction as a free nation. But she also knew there was nothing she could do to help them. The situation became personal when a group of Apache refugees appeared at the edge of their town. These were not warriors, but families fleeing the violence, seeking temporary shelter before continuing their journey to safer territory. Most of the townspeople wanted nothing to do with them, but Thomas quietly arranged for supplies and safe passage, using his trading connections to help them continue their escape. Among the refugees was an elderly woman named Itza, who recognized Ayana despite the years of separation and the different clothes she now wore. Itza had been a friend of Ayana's grandmother and remembered the young woman from her childhood. The recognition was mutual, and Ayana felt her heart leap at this unexpected connection to her past. The meeting had to be kept secret, as the townspeople would not have tolerated their newest residents harboring Apache refugees. In whispered conversations conducted in their native language, Itza told Ayana about the fates of various family members and friends. Some had died in the fighting, others had been captured and sent to reservations, and a few had escaped to Mexico, where Apache communities still maintained some freedom. Most importantly, Itza brought word about Ayana's surviving family members. Her mother, Desba, was still alive but had been severely wounded in an attack on their camp. She was living with Kuruk and his family, but her health was failing. Ayana's younger sister had married and moved away before the worst of the fighting began, while her youngest brother had joined a group of young warriors who were still resisting capture in the most remote mountain areas. The news filled Ayana with a desperate longing to see her family one last time. She begged Itza to take a message to her mother, some way of letting Desba know that her daughter still lived and thought of home every day. But Itza shook her head sadly, explaining that Chief Nalnish's decree of disownment was still in effect. Even though he was dead, the tribal council honored his decision and Ayana remained officially erased from Apache memory. However, Itza had not sought out Ayana merely to deliver painful news. She had come with a purpose that went beyond the official position of the tribal leadership. She had been present when Ayana's children were born in Apache territory, before the troubles began, and she had performed the traditional blessing ceremonies for them in secret. In Apache law, this made her partially responsible for their spiritual welfare. Itza revealed that some of the older Apache women had been discussing Ayana's children among themselves. These grandmothers and great-aunts were concerned about the young ones growing up without proper connection to their Apache heritage. They had sent Itza to evaluate the children and determine whether anything could be done to help them. Despite their mother's exile, the old woman spent several days observing Sarah, David, and Michael from a distance. She watched how they moved, listened to fragments of Apache words their mother had taught them, and noted the signs of their mixed heritage in their features and behaviors. Her assessment was both encouraging and sobering. Sarah, she concluded, had the strongest connection to her Apache blood. The girl showed natural aptitude for the traditional skills Ayana had managed to teach her, and she carried herself with a dignity that reminded Itza of notable Apache women from the past. David was more conflicted, pulled between his father's world and his mother's heritage, but he showed potential for bridging both cultures. Michael, the youngest, was still too young to evaluate completely, but he showed the kind of spiritual sensitivity that was valued among traditional Apache. Itza made a shocking proposition to Ayana. A small group of Apache had escaped the military roundups and were planning to establish a hidden community in the remote canyons of northern Mexico. They needed all the Apache blood they could gather to ensure their survival as a people. If Ayana's children could prove their worth and commitment to Apache ways, they might be welcomed into this refuge community despite their mixed parentage. The offer presented Ayana with an agonizing choice. Her children could potentially claim their Apache heritage and grow up among their mother's people, but it would mean separating them from Thomas and the white world entirely. They would have to abandon everything they had known and prove themselves worthy of acceptance through dangerous trials and demonstrations of cultural knowledge. Sarah overheard enough of these whispered conversations to understand what was being offered. The 8-year-old girl approached her mother privately and declared that she wanted to go with Itza to learn properly about her Apache heritage and take her place among her mother's people. Her determination was fierce and unshakable, despite Ayana's attempts to explain the dangers and difficulties such a choice would involve. David was more hesitant, Torn between loyalty to his father and curiosity about the Apache way of life, he was old enough to understand that such a decision would mean never seeing Thomas again, and the thought frightened him. But he was also drawn to the idea of belonging somewhere completely, of not always being caught between two identities that never quite fit together. The decision became even more complex when Thomas learned about Itzah's offer. His first instinct was to refuse absolutely, not willing to lose his children to a world that had already taken so much from his wife. But he also recognized that this might be the only chance his children would ever have to claim their full heritage and find acceptance within a community that truly understood them. The final decision came through an unexpected turn of events that nobody could have predicted. Word reached the hidden Apache community in Mexico that Ayana's brother Kuruk had survived a major battle and was searching for ways to preserve what remained of their scattered people. Through Itzah's network of contacts, he learned that his sister was still alive and had children who carried Apache blood. Kuruk's message to Ayana was brief but powerful. He wrote that their father's anger had died with him on the battlefield, that the old rules meant nothing when their entire way of life was disappearing. The Apache needed every person with tribal blood to help rebuild their nation, and Ayana's children represented hope for the future. He formally invited his sister to return home, offering to sponsor her re-entry into Apache society and to accept her husband as an adopted member of the tribe. The invitation came with conditions that reflected the desperate circumstances of the Apache people. Thomas would have to prove his loyalty by using his trading skills to help supply the hidden community. He would need to learn Apache language and customs completely, abandoning his previous identity as thoroughly as Ayana had once abandoned hers. The children would undergo traditional Apache education, learning not just the culture but the survival skills necessary for life in the harsh canyon refuges. For the first time in years, Ayana felt genuine hope stirring in her heart. The possibility of reconciliation with her family seemed like a miracle she had never dared to dream possible. She could return to her people not as a shameful exile, but as a contributing member bringing valuable resources and connections. Her children could grow up knowing their full heritage, accepted and celebrated rather than merely tolerated. Thomas surprised everyone, including himself, by embracing the opportunity without hesitation. The years of watching his wife fade away from loneliness and seeing his children struggle with their divided identity had convinced him that radical change was necessary. He had grown to love Apache culture through Ayana's teachings, and the prospect of finally belonging somewhere completely appealed to him deeply. The logistics of joining the hidden community were complex and dangerous. The Apache refugees operated in constant fear of discovery by military patrols or hostile Mexican authorities. Moving a family with mixed blood would require careful planning and trusted guides. Itzah explained that they would need to abandon most of their possessions and travel light through treacherous mountain passes. Sarah's reaction to the news was pure joy. She had been preparing for this moment without knowing it, absorbing every piece of Apache knowledge her mother could share. She immediately began practicing with traditional weapons and learning advanced language skills, determined to prove herself worthy of full acceptance among her mother's people. David and Michael were more apprehensive about the dramatic change, but they were also excited by the prospect of adventure and belonging. They had grown tired of being outsiders everywhere they went, and the idea of a place where their mixed heritage would be seen as an asset rather than a liability was appealing. The family spent weeks preparing for their journey, selling what possessions they could and converting everything else into portable wealth and useful supplies. Thomas arranged for his trading business to be managed by trusted partners, creating a network that could continue supporting the Apache community even after he joined them permanently. The night before their departure, Ayana stood outside their cabin looking at the stars and feeling emotions she had thought were lost forever. The constellation patterns were the same ones her grandmother had taught her to read as a child, and for the first time in years, she felt truly connected to her Apache heritage. The painful years of exile and isolation now seemed like a necessary journey that had prepared her family for this moment of redemption. The journey to Mexico took 2 months of careful travel through hostile territory. The family learned to live like Apache raiders, moving at night and hiding during the day, surviving on minimal supplies and whatever they could gather from the land. It was hard, dangerous work, but it also served as intensive training in traditional Apache survival skills. When they finally reached the Hidden Canyon community, Ayanna was overwhelmed by the sight of Apache families living freely according to traditional ways. Children played traditional games, elders told ancient stories, and women worked at crafts that had been practiced for countless generations. It was like stepping back in time to the world of her childhood, preserved against all odds in this remote refuge. Kuruk's greeting of his sister was emotional and healing. The years of separation and the tragedies they had both endured had changed them, but the bond of family proved stronger than the forces that had tried to break it. He welcomed Thomas formally into the tribe, acknowledging the sacrifices the white man had made for Apache family and recognizing his potential value to their community. The integration process was challenging but ultimately successful. Sarah adapted quickly to traditional Apache life, earning praise from the elders for her dedication and skill. David found his place among the young warriors, learning to balance his father's trading knowledge with Apache fighting traditions. Michael, though still very young, began developing the spiritual awareness that would make him valuable as a future medicine man. Thomas threw himself into his new role with characteristic determination. He established trading relationships that brought essential supplies to the hidden community while maintaining secrecy about their location. His knowledge of the outside world proved invaluable for protecting the Apache from military searches and hostile neighbors. Ayanna found herself becoming a bridge between the old Apache ways and the realities of survival in a changing world. Her experiences in white society, painful as they had been, gave her insights that helped the community adapt without losing their essential identity. She became a respected voice in tribal councils, consulted on matters involving contact with the outside world. The hidden community thrived for many years, with Ayanna's family playing crucial roles in its success. They had found what they had been searching for throughout their difficult journey, a place where love could exist without requiring impossible choices, where children could grow up whole and proud of their complete heritage. The pain Ayanna had borne alone for so many years was finally transformed into strength that benefited not just her own family, but the entire Apache nation fighting to survive and preserve their way of life.